The Renaissance European Theater, Elizabethan and Jacobean Era by Holly Brosnan and Devin White. Let's begin with a brief history lesson of how theater was created during the Elizabethan era. The English Renaissance Theater, more commonly known as Elizabethan theater, refers to the theater of England between 1562 and 1642. This is the style of the plays of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. The Renaissance started in Italy in the mid-14th century. The term Renaissance is a French word for rebirth. In the 12th and 13th centuries, there was an increase in sophistication of thinking, and thus there was an improvement in religion, arts, and basic society. The Renaissance was spread to Europe through the use of transportation and the printing press. The first introduction of the Renaissance to Europe was spread through the influence of Henry VII. Henry VII was the King of England and Lord of Ireland, who had started the movement toward a more theatrical England. The English Renaissance's high peak lasted 15 years. Most of this period was during the 1590s. The entire Renaissance had started at the end of Elizabeth I's reign and went through the reign of James I of England. The spread of theater started through the traveling actors who moved from one town to the next, spreading acting. The success of theater in England during the Renaissance era has most thanks to Queen Elizabeth herself. Due to her hierarchy and influence on society, she made playwriters more famous. She built theaters that could hold very large audiences for people to attend. Now we are going to talk about the major influences theater had on society and what drove people to the theaters. The influence that theater had on society was huge. People loved plays. People would go to plays as often as they were able because they could personally relate to the stories that the plays were telling. Most common plays people went to were tragedies or comedies. Lastly, we are going to dive into architecture of the theater structures during the era. When Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, there were no specially designed theater buildings in England. Companies of actors had to tour the country and perform in a wide variety of temporary acting spaces, such as halls, churches, and even open spaces. The architecture structures of the theaters during this era were mostly based on the great structures of classic antiquity. The designs were based on a structure similar to the Colosseum in ancient Rome. Architecture on a grand scale, which would house a capacity of between 1,500 and 3,000 people. Classic Greek and Roman architecture was admired by the Elizabethans, and sometimes great columns framed the entrances of many great Elizabethan houses. The most well-known, more commonly used, and famous theater during that time, and still to this day, is the Globe Theatre, located in central London. During the time, it was associated with William Shakespeare. It was actually built by Shakespeare's playing company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, in 1599. It was unfortunately later destroyed by a fire on June 29, 1613. Although a second Globe Theatre was built at the same exact site as the first Globe Theatre in June of 1614, but then later closed in 1642. The Jacobean era also coincides with the Elizabethan era, but there are many similarities and differences. Let's find out more about the Jacobean era.
Now let's move on to the Jacobean era. This reign started with James I, which came right after Elizabeth I. The Elizabethan era led a whole new movement for theater during this time, and greatly influenced the Jacobean era and how society was viewing shows, as well as opening a new door for playwrights. During James's reign from 1603 to 1625, England and Scotland were unified, and this part of the English Renaissance was formally focused on literature, music, and theater. Differing from Elizabethan theater, the Jacobean theater was filled with an array of comedies and tragedies mixed between playwrights. Audiences at this time were ranked from a higher to lower class. Private playhouses were reserved mainly for royals and aristocratic class members, while normal playhouses were reserved to commoners, and that is where the audiences truly engaged in the performances. They would applaud and cry between comedic and tragic scenes, and unlike audiences today, crowds would consist of just a few people instead of thousands, so plays seemed more intimate. During the Jacobean era, many new playwrights rose to fame. We will give just a top 5 of these playwrights and give a brief explanation of the shows these men worked on and or created. Number 1. John Fletcher. Born 1579 to 1625. Fletcher wrote one of the greatest comedic pieces during this time in collaboration with another Jacobean playwright named Francis Beaumont, called The Night of the Burning Pestle, and also worked on shows as collaboration in Cupid's Revenge and The Maid's Tragedy. Number 2. John Webster. Born 1580 to 1634. Webster was known for writing during the time of Shakespeare and wrote 2 major tragedies, one called The White Devil and 2, The Duchess of Malfi. He was also known for a tragic comedy called The Devil's Law Case, and even though he was known for these tragedies, he worked alongside with Jacobean playwright Thomas Middleton and wrote a comedy called Anything for a Quiet Life. Number 3. Thomas Middleton. Born 1580 to 1627. Middleton was considered one of the best playwrights during his time, and was not only appreciated for his comedies, but also his tragedies. His best comedy at this time was a play called A Chaste Maid in Cheapside, and was also known for writing off of Shakespearean plays as well. Number 4. Ben Jonson. Born 1572 to 1637. After the death of Shakespeare, Jonson was known as the best playwright of his time. He wrote a numerous amount of plays, but his most popular works included Volpone, The Alchemist, Bartholomew Fair, and Epicone, and had other plays such as Every Man in His Humor, Every Man Out of His Humor, and many more. And lastly, at number 5, we have William Shakespeare, born 1564 to 1616. Even though Shakespeare was primarily known for writing some of his most popular works during the Elizabethan era, he also wrote some of his most iconic works during the Jacobean era, such as The Tempest, King Lear, and Macbeth. Audiences would attend mainly public playhouses to view shows, and seating arrangements were built around an open space for the audience. There are many popular playhouses used throughout the Jacobean era, such as the Curtain, the Fortune, and the Swan, but the 2 most iconic were the Blackfriars Theatre and the Globe Theatre. The Blackfriars Theatre was established in the late 1500s and was used to perform shows by Middleton, Jonson, and Fletcher. The Globe Theatre, being the most iconic during the Renaissance, featured many works by Shakespeare, and was built in 1599 and rebuilt in 1614. Thank you again for watching our video, and stick around to the end to view our formal works cited page so that you can use the sources at hand to gain more information on the 2 eras that were discussed in this video. Thank you.